The card on my plate said the failure, and somehow, nobody at the Easter table looked surprised. I remember standing in the doorway of my son's dining room, holding a glass casserole dish against my chest while the smell of honey-glazed ham and cinnamon rolls drifted through the house. Outside, spring sunlight stretched across the Connecticut lawn, touching the white tulips Vanessa planted every April like she was decorating a magazine cover instead of a home. Inside, everyone was already seated. My granddaughter Emily looked up first, then quickly looked back down at her plate. That was the first sign something was wrong. Daniel kissed my cheek without standing up. "Happy Easter, Mom," he said quietly, already reaching for his iced tea before our eyes fully met. Vanessa smiled from the far side of the table, polished and graceful in a pale blue dress that probably cost more than my first car. "We saved your seat," she said. Her voice sounded sweet enough to fool strangers. Maybe that was why she got away with so much. I walked slowly around the table, past pastel napkins folded into little rabbits, past crystal bowls filled with candy eggs, past framed family photos from ski trips and beach vacations I somehow never attended. Then I saw it. My place card sat directly beside the deviled eggs. Thick black cursive. 2 words. The failure. I stopped walking. For a second, I honestly wondered if I was misreading it. At 68, your eyes play tricks sometimes. But no. The letters were dark and sharp against the cream-colored cardstock. The failure. Not Helen. Not Mom. Not Grandma. The failure. I waited for someone to react. Anyone. A laugh. An apology. A shocked expression. But silverware continued clinking softly against plates. My sister-in-law kept buttering a dinner roll. Daniel stared at his phone. Vanessa adjusted the sleeve of her dress and reached for the serving spoon like nothing unusual had happened. Emily looked sick. That was the second sign. "Is something wrong?" Vanessa finally asked, tilting her head with practiced innocence. I looked down at the card again. Then I smiled. Not because it was funny, and not because it didn't hurt. It did. Hurt. More than I expected. But after losing my husband 3 years earlier, after spending holidays slowly disappearing from family photographs like a ghost nobody wanted to mention, I had learned something important. The people trying hardest to humiliate you usually need your silence more than your anger. So I sat down carefully and placed my purse beside the chair. "Everything looks beautiful," I said softly. Vanessa's smile twitched for half a second, just enough for me to notice. Lunch moved forward like a theater performance everyone had rehearsed except me. Vanessa directed conversations with the ease of a television host. She asked about promotions, private schools, vacation homes. Every topic floated effortlessly toward success, toward achievement, toward money. And every so often, she glanced at me with that tiny polished smile women like her perfect over years of social climbing. "Helen always preferred simpler things," she told one cousin after discussing European travel plans. "She's never really been ambitious." A few people chuckled politely. I folded my napkin once. Then again, the paper softened in my hands. Across the table, Emily barely touched her food. Daniel laughed louder than necessary at one of Vanessa's jokes, the way men do when they're afraid of tension entering the room. I watched him carefully. My son used to defend me over the smallest things. When he was 12, he cried because a cashier spoke rudely to me at a grocery store. Now he couldn't even look at the card sitting 3 feet away from his plate. That hurt worse than the words themselves. Halfway through dessert, Vanessa stood to organize photos for social media. "Everybody closer," she sang cheerfully. "We need one nice Easter picture this year." This year. As if happiness could be arranged like table decorations. Everyone gathered near the fireplace beneath the giant wreath Vanessa changed every season. I started to stand too, but Vanessa touched my arm lightly. "Oh, Helen," she said with a sympathetic little smile. "Maybe just this one without you? The lighting's tight." The room went quiet for one long second. Nobody objected. Nobody moved. And suddenly, for the first time all afternoon, something inside me became perfectly clear. This wasn't accidental cruelty. It was a story. A role they had assigned me long ago. The burden. The embarrassment. The woman slowly being erased so nobody would question it later. I looked around the room at the matching pastel outfits, the polished smiles, the expensive furniture my late husband once helped pay for. Then I looked back at the card still sitting alone at the table. The failure. And in that moment, I realized humiliation only works when you still need acceptance from the people humiliating you. After the photographs were finished, people drifted back toward the dining room, carrying coffee cups and slices of carrot cake on small white plates. The house sounded loud again. Too loud. Laughter bounced off the high ceilings in sharp little bursts that felt rehearsed instead of natural. I stayed near the fireplace for a moment, smoothing invisible wrinkles from my sweater while nobody spoke directly to me. That was the strange thing about being quietly pushed out of a family. There was rarely one dramatic moment. It happened slowly, through smaller and smaller exclusions, until eventually your absence felt more comfortable to everyone than your presence. Vanessa moved gracefully through the room, collecting empty glasses with one hand while complimenting people with the other. "You look incredible, Susan. Oh my goodness, that bracelet is gorgeous. Daniel, help Uncle Robert with his coat." She managed every detail perfectly. That was part of her talent. People trusted women who remembered napkins and birthdays and how everyone liked their coffee. They never noticed the colder things hidden underneath. I walked back toward the table to collect my purse. The card was still there beside my plate. Nobody had removed it. I stared at it for another second before slipping it quietly into my handbag. Something told me I would need it later. Emily appeared beside me so softly, I almost jumped. "Grandma," she whispered, glancing nervously toward the kitchen. "I am really sorry." Her voice cracked on the last word. I studied her face carefully. Unlike the others, she looked genuinely distressed. "You do not need to apologize for things adults choose to do," I said gently. Emily swallowed hard. Mom thought it was funny. There it was. Not denial. Not confusion. Confirmation. I nodded once and rested my hand lightly against her shoulder. "Thank you for telling me the truth." She looked relieved and terrified at the same time before Vanessa called her name from across the room. "Emily, sweetheart, come help me with the desserts." Emily hesitated. Then she walked away slowly without meeting her mother's eyes. I watched the tension in her shoulders and suddenly remembered another Easter nearly 15 years earlier. Daniel had hidden plastic eggs all over our backyard while my husband Richard grilled hamburgers on the patio. Emily had been so small then. Tiny pink rain boots. Chocolate smeared across her cheeks. Vanessa arrived late that year wearing a white cashmere sweater and carrying an expensive bakery pie. She made sure everyone noticed. Even back then she understood performance. Richard noticed it too. One night after they left, he stood at the kitchen sink drying dishes and said quietly, "That woman does not love people, Helen. She loves control." At the time, I thought he was being unfair. Now I wondered how many things my husband had seen long before I did. Daniel entered the dining room carrying a stack of plates. "Mom," he said carefully, "do not take today personally. Vanessa was only joking." I almost smiled at the absurdity of it. A joke. Humiliation always became a joke once someone demanded accountability for it. "Of course," I said calmly. "People usually label their loved ones' failures for comedy." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck the way he used to as a teenager when he felt cornered. "You know what I mean." "No, actually, I did not anymore." I looked at my son standing there in his pressed blue shirt and polished brown shoes, and for the first time in my life, I realized how frightened he was of disappointing his wife. More frightened than he was of losing his mother. That realization settled quietly inside me like winter snow. Cold, silent, permanent. Across the room, Vanessa laughed brightly at something one of the cousins said while refilling champagne glasses left over from brunch. Her voice floated easily through the house, warm and charming and effortless. But now I noticed something I had missed before. Every conversation bent around her approval. Every person adjusted themselves slightly whenever she entered the room. It was not love keeping this family together anymore. It was management. And suddenly, sitting there beneath pastel decorations and ceramic rabbits while spring sunlight faded across the windows, I began wondering how long they had been preparing to turn me into someone disposable. I left a little after 5 o'clock. The sky outside had turned pale gray, and cold spring wind carried the smell of damp grass across the driveway. Vanessa stood near the front door hugging relatives goodbye, like the perfect hostess from a department store catalog. "Drive safe, Helen," she called sweetly as I walked to my car. I turned back long enough to smile politely. "Happy Easter, Vanessa." She looked almost disappointed by how calm I sounded. During the drive home, I kept the radio off. The silence felt cleaner. Houses blurred past my windows one after another, white fences and trimmed hedges and bicycles abandoned in suburban front yards. Families were probably finishing dinners inside those homes. Children searching for candy hidden in plastic eggs. Grandmothers washing dishes while someone packed leftovers into containers. Simple things. Normal things. I could not remember the last holiday that felt normal for me. By the time I reached my neighborhood, dusk had settled over the streets. My little colonial house stood exactly as I left it that morning, quiet and still beneath the budding maple trees Richard planted 20 years ago. I sat in the driveway for a long moment before going inside. The silence no longer felt lonely tonight. It felt revealing. Inside, I placed my purse carefully on the kitchen counter and removed the card from earlier. The thick black letters stared back at me beneath the warm overhead light. The failure. I traced the edge of the cardstock slowly with my thumb. Strange how two words could suddenly rearrange years of memories. I opened the refrigerator and stared absently at leftovers from the previous week. Turkey soup, grapes, half a pie from the church bake sale. Then another memory surfaced quietly. Thanksgiving 3 years earlier. Vanessa reorganizing the seating chart at the last minute because she said the grandchildren needed more space near the television room. I ended up alone beside the hallway while everyone else laughed together near the fireplace. Christmas the following year. Family matching pajamas ordered for everyone except me because Vanessa claimed the website sold out of my size. Daniel telling me not to make it awkward. Last summer at Emily's piano recital, when Vanessa introduced me to another parent as Daniel's mother, instead of using my name. Tiny cuts. Tiny humiliations. So small individually that protesting them would have made me sound paranoid. But together they formed something unmistakable. A pattern. I carried the card into the living room and sat down in Richard's old leather chair beside the window. His reading lamp still stood exactly where he left it. For years after his death, I avoided touching anything in this room because I thought preserving objects might preserve grief in a manageable shape. But grief changes anyway. It hardens, evolves, learns things. I glanced toward the bookshelf and suddenly remembered a conversation from the final winter before Richard passed away. Snow had been falling heavily outside while we drank coffee late at night in this very room. He looked unusually serious. If something ever feels wrong with Daniel and Vanessa, he told me quietly, promise me you will pay attention the first time, not the 10th. At the time, I brushed it aside. I thought he was simply protective. Richard came from a generation of men who noticed danger early and trusted almost nobody. I used to tease him for it. Now I wondered if caution had simply made him observant. My phone buzzed softly against the side table. A text from Daniel. Mom, do not dwell on today. Vanessa feels bad if you misunderstood the joke. I stared at the message for several seconds. Not once did he say it was cruel. Not once did he say it should not have happened. Only that I misunderstood it. Slowly, I placed the phone face down without replying. Outside the window, rain began tapping lightly against the glass. The room darkened around me as evening settled fully over the neighborhood. And for the first time since Richard died, I began considering a possibility I had avoided for years. Maybe this family had not slowly drifted away from me by accident. Maybe someone had carefully taught them how. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. Rain still clung to the windows in thin silver lines, and the house carried that quiet hollow sound homes make before sunrise. I made coffee slowly, measuring grounds the same way Richard always did, 2 careful scoops for every cup. Some habits survive grief because they become muscle memory instead of emotion. I carried the mug into the dining room and sat beneath the old chandelier we bought during our 25th anniversary trip to Vermont. For years this room hosted birthdays, graduations, Christmas dinners, and noisy Sunday breakfasts. Now most holidays happen somewhere else. Usually at Vanessa's house. Usually under her control. My phone buzzed again just after 7:30. Another message from Daniel. Mom, Vanessa is upset. Emily told her you seemed offended yesterday. I stared at the words for a long moment. Not concerned. Not apologetic. Upset. Vanessa was upset. Somehow the person publicly humiliated had already become the problem needing management. I placed the phone down beside my untouched coffee and looked around the quiet room. Then I laughed softly to myself for the first time in months. Not because anything was funny. Because suddenly everything made sense. Around noon, someone knocked gently at my front door. I opened it expecting a delivery driver or church volunteer. Instead, Emily stood on the porch wearing an oversized gray sweatshirt with her hair pulled into a loose ponytail. She looked nervous enough to cry. I told Mom I was studying with friends. She admitted quietly before I could speak. I stepped aside immediately. "Come in, sweetheart." She entered carefully, glancing around the house like someone walking through memories instead of rooms. Emily used to spend entire weekends here when she was younger, baking cookies with Richard, watching old movies beside the fireplace. After Vanessa became stricter about schedules and activities, those visits slowly disappeared too. I led her into the kitchen and placed a plate of blueberry muffins on the table. Emily wrapped both hands around the mug of hot chocolate I made her without asking. Richard always said frightened people needed something warm in their hands. For several minutes, she said nothing. Then finally she whispered, "Grandma, Mama's been talking about you for years." The sentence landed quietly between us. I did not interrupt. Emily stared down into her mug. "She tells people you are emotionally draining, that you make Daniel feel guilty all the time. She says you want attention whenever holidays are not about you." I listened without reacting. Outside, wind pushed soft rain against the kitchen windows while the clock above the stove ticked steadily through the silence. "Did your father believe those things?" I asked gently. Emily hesitated too long before answering. "I think he started to." That hurt. More than the card. More than the jokes. Because love does not disappear all at once. Usually it gets rewritten slowly by repetition. Story after story. Comment after comment. Until someone begins remembering you differently than you truly were. Emily reached into the pocket of her sweatshirt and pulled out her phone. "There is something else," she whispered. She opened a group message thread filled with pastel Easter decorations and family planning notes. Vanessa's name appeared repeatedly. My eyes stopped on one message immediately. "Put Helen near the end of the table again. We do not need one of her depressing moods ruining pictures." Another message followed beneath it. "And somebody please do not forget the joke card this year." This year. I read those two words twice. Then a third time. My chest tightened slightly, but not from sadness anymore. Clarity feels different than sadness. Colder. Cleaner. Emily looked horrified watching me read. "I did not know she was really going to do it," she said quickly. "I thought it was another one of her mean jokes." I handed the phone back carefully and folded my hands together on the table. Suddenly, I remembered something Richard told me shortly before he died. "Control is never loud at first, Helen. Real control sounds reasonable." Sitting there across from my trembling granddaughter while rain darkened the spring afternoon outside, I finally understood exactly what he meant. After Emily left that afternoon, the house felt different. Not emptier. Sharper. Like a photograph finally coming into focus after years of blur. I stood alone in the kitchen holding my coffee cup long after it turned cold, replaying every conversation I had dismissed over the years because I wanted peace more than truth. That was the dangerous thing about people like Vanessa. They understood that decent people avoid conflict. They used kindness as camouflage and patience as a weapon. By evening, the rain finally stopped. Thin gold sunlight stretched across the backyard, catching on the wet grass and the old wooden swing Richard built for Emily when she was 6 years old. I had not noticed until then how weathered it looked. One chain hung slightly crooked. The blue paint had faded almost completely away. Time leaves marks quietly when nobody is paying attention. I walked upstairs to the bedroom Richard and I once shared and opened the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Inside were old photo albums, tax records, insurance papers, and dozens of neatly labeled folders in Richard's careful handwriting. My husband believed important things should always be organized. "Confusion costs people money," he used to say, "and sometimes more than money." I sat cross-legged on the carpet and began sorting through the files slowly while evening shadows deepened around the room. Bank statements, property taxes, retirement documents. Then finally, near the bottom of the chest, I found a sealed manila envelope with my name written across the front. Helen. Nothing else. My pulse quickened slightly as I opened it. Inside sat several documents along with a handwritten note dated 8 months before Richard passed away. I recognized his handwriting instantly. Steady, precise, familiar enough to ache. "If you are reading this," the note began, "then certain behaviors I worried about may have become impossible to ignore." I stopped breathing for a moment. Outside, tree branches scraped softly against the window in the evening wind. I continued reading slowly. Richard explained that during the final years of his life, he began noticing unusual interest from Vanessa whenever finances or property came up in conversation. Questions about account structures, ownership percentages, life insurance timelines. At first, he thought she was simply practical. Later, he changed his mind. One sentence stayed with me longer than the others. Vanessa does not value family the way you do. She values access. I read that line 3 times. Then I reached for the attached documents with trembling fingers. My eyes widened almost immediately. Years earlier, Richard had quietly transferred the majority ownership of several investment accounts and 2 commercial properties entirely into my name through a private trust. Properties Daniel believed belonged equally to him after Richard's death. Properties Vanessa had referenced repeatedly over the years whenever discussing future family plans. Suddenly, dozens of conversations replayed differently in my mind. Vanessa encouraging me to move into a retirement community so life would feel simpler. Daniel suggesting I let him temporarily manage certain finances because paperwork stressed me out after becoming widowed. Even the strange pressure to sell this house during the previous Christmas. They were not preparing for my comfort. They were preparing for transfer. I leaned back slowly against the bed, the papers spread across my lap like pieces of someone else's life. For years, I believed I was fading naturally from the center of my family because age changes things, because younger people become busy, because widows eventually drift toward the edges of gatherings. But now I saw the truth. My isolation had not happened accidentally. It had been encouraged. Carefully, patiently, strategically. And suddenly the card from Easter no longer felt childish or random. It was messaging. A label repeated often enough that eventually everyone around me would stop questioning it. The failure, the burden, the unstable old woman. Because if they could reduce me emotionally first, then one day taking everything else from me would seem reasonable too. I looked down at Richard's final note resting in my hands beneath the soft yellow bedroom lamp. At the bottom of the page, he had written one final sentence. Do not confuse silence with weakness, Helen. Some people mistake kindness for permission. For the first time in years, I smiled without sadness. The following week, I changed nothing on the surface. That was important. People become suspicious when kindness disappears too suddenly. So I continued answering Daniel's calls. I continued attending Sunday service. I continued mailing birthday cards with handwritten notes inside, the same way I always had. But privately, I stopped offering access to myself in ways nobody had even noticed before. Tuesday morning, Daniel called while I was trimming roses in the backyard. Mom, quick question, he said casually. The property tax payment for our place bounced because the bank flagged something. Could you spot us for a few days like last year? Last year. I remembered it clearly now. Vanessa crying softly at my kitchen table while explaining there had been a delay with Daniel's bonus. I wrote the check within 10 minutes because helping family felt natural back then. I am afraid I cannot this time, I answered calmly, brushing dirt from my gardening gloves. Silence stretched briefly across the line. Oh, Daniel said. Everything okay? Everything is fine. Another pause. You sound different lately. I looked across the yard at the swing Richard built all those years ago. Maybe I finally sound rested. After we hung up, I noticed something strange. I did not feel guilty. For years, guilt had controlled nearly every decision I made. Guilt for saying no. Guilt for asking questions. Guilt for noticing disrespect at all. Vanessa understood that about me better than anyone. She built entire systems around my discomfort with conflict. By Thursday afternoon, another message arrived. This time from Vanessa herself. Helen, we are reorganizing some financial paperwork, and Daniel mentioned you might still have copies of Richard's old investment records. We should probably consolidate everything for simplicity. Simplicity. Such a harmless-sounding word. I stared at the message while sitting at my dining room table beneath warm afternoon sunlight. Then I typed back slowly. Thank you for checking. Everything is already organized. Her response came almost immediately. Perfect. Daniel worries you handle too much alone. I almost laughed. Suddenly, everyone seemed deeply concerned about my independence. That evening, I drove downtown to meet with Richard's attorney, Martin Keller, a quiet man in his 70s who still wore expensive suits like he belonged to another generation entirely. His office smelled faintly of old books and cedar wood. After reviewing the trust documents carefully, Martin removed his glasses and looked at me for a long moment. Richard anticipated pressure eventually, he said quietly. He instructed me to contact you immediately if certain patterns appeared. I folded my hands together tightly in my lap. What kind of patterns? Martin's expression remained careful. Attempts to isolate you emotionally. Increased interest in transfers. Efforts to establish doubts about your stability or judgment. The room suddenly felt very still. Outside his office window, traffic moved steadily through the late afternoon streets, while somewhere nearby a siren echoed faintly in the distance. He saw all of this coming? I asked softly. Martin nodded once. Your husband loved you very much, Helen. But he also understood people. I drove home slowly after that meeting, noticing things I had ignored for years. The expensive SUV Daniel and Vanessa recently purchased despite always discussing money problems. The vacation photos constantly appearing online. The kitchen renovation Vanessa called modest, even though it probably cost more than my first house. They were not struggling. They were positioning. And suddenly I understood why the humiliation at Easter felt so deliberate. They needed me diminished before they asked for more. That night, I opened the family group chat for the first time in weeks. Vanessa had posted smiling photos from Easter dinner, beneath cheerful captions about gratitude and togetherness. In every picture, she stood at the center while everyone else angled slightly toward her approval. I noticed something else too. I was barely visible in any of them. In one photograph, only my shoulder appeared near the edge of the frame. Cropped, partial, almost gone. I studied the image quietly before setting my phone aside. Then, for the first time since Richard died, I locked every financial file in the house inside the old safe in our bedroom closet and changed the access code. 3 days later, the first crack finally appeared. Not in private, not behind closed doors, publicly, which was fitting, considering humiliation had always been Vanessa's favorite stage performance. It started on a Thursday evening while I was watering herbs on the back patio. My phone buzzed repeatedly against the outdoor table beside me. At first I ignored it. Then Emily called directly. Her voice sounded breathless. Grandma, do not panic, but Mom is freaking out right now. I lowered the watering can slowly. Why? There was a pause filled with distant shouting somewhere behind her. I accidentally uploaded the wrong Easter photo to Facebook. I said nothing. Suddenly my heartbeat felt strangely calm. What kind of wrong photo? Emily inhaled sharply. The one with the card on the table. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. I could hear muffled movement in the background. Cabinet doors slamming. Vanessa's voice rising somewhere farther away inside the house. Then Emily whispered, "People saw it before Mom deleted it." I sat down carefully in the patio chair while evening sunlight stretched long shadows across the yard. How many people? A lot. Emily sounded close to tears now. Church people commented asking what it meant. Aunt Susan called Dad. Mom keeps saying it was taken out of context. Out of context. I almost smiled at the phrase. Cruelty always sounds ridiculous once daylight reaches it. Within an hour, my phone began filling with messages. Some awkward, some overly cheerful, some pretending concern while clearly searching for gossip. Helen, I am sure there is a simple explanation. Families joke differently these days. You know how social media creates misunderstandings. Not one person asked the obvious question. Why would a mother be labeled that way at all? Because people fear conflict almost as much as they fear truth. Around 7:30, Daniel called. I answered on the fourth ring. Mom. He began immediately, his voice tight with panic. You know Vanessa never meant anything harmful by that. I leaned back slowly in my chair and watched wind move softly through the maple trees. Interesting, I said quietly. You sound very worried for someone discussing a harmless joke. Silence. Then a frustrated exhale. People are blowing this up online. There it was. Not concern about my feelings. Concern about appearances. Church friends are calling Vanessa. He continued quickly. Emily made a stupid mistake posting that picture. No, I said calmly. The mistake happened before the picture. Another silence followed. Longer this time. Mom, Daniel said carefully. You have been acting distant lately. I closed my eyes briefly. Even now, he framed my reaction as the problem instead of the behavior causing it. Distance usually appears after clarity, I answered softly. He did not respond. Somewhere in the background, I heard Vanessa speaking rapidly. Her voice carried that sharp, polished tone women use when control begins slipping publicly through their fingers. Daniel lowered his voice. Can we all just move past this? I looked down at my gardening gloves resting neatly in my lap. For years, I would have agreed immediately. Smoothed everything over. Protected everyone from discomfort. But suddenly I understood something important. Peace built on humiliation is not peace. It is compliance. I think, I said quietly, your wife underestimated how things look once other people can see them too. Then I ended the call before he could answer. The next morning, I attended my usual women's Bible study at church. The atmosphere felt different the moment I entered the fellowship hall. Too polite. Too careful. Women who normally waved casually now studied me with uneasy sympathy. Mrs. Patterson squeezed my hand slightly too long while offering coffee. Another woman avoided eye contact altogether. Vanessa's social perfection had cracked just enough for people to glimpse something underneath. During prayer requests, nobody mentioned Easter directly. But afterward, while gathering my coat near the entrance, I overheard two women whispering beside the donation table. I always thought Helen seemed lovely. Honestly, Vanessa can be a little controlling. Small comments, quiet observations, but reputations rarely collapse all at once. They erode slowly after people finally permit themselves to notice what was always there. Driving home beneath bright spring skies, I realized something unexpected. Vanessa was not frightened because she hurt me. She was frightened because the audience had changed. 1 week later, I invited the family to dinner. Not a holiday, not a birthday, just a simple Saturday evening gathering at my house. Daniel sounded surprised when I called. Everything okay? He asked cautiously. Of course, I replied warmly. I thought it would be nice for everyone to spend time together. He hesitated before agreeing. I knew Vanessa would come. People who rely on control rarely ignore invitations they cannot predict. Saturday arrived bright and unusually warm for early April. By 6 o'clock, the dining room glowed softly beneath candlelight, while jazz music drifted quietly through the house. I cooked all of Daniel's childhood favorites. Pot roast, garlic mashed potatoes, buttered green beans, apple pie cooling beside the kitchen window. Familiar food makes people lower their guard. Vanessa arrived precisely on time, wearing cream-colored slacks, and a smile polished carefully back into place. Helen, she said sweetly while handing me a bottle of wine. This is so thoughtful. Thoughtful. Another harmless word that suddenly sounded artificial coming from her. Daniel kissed my cheek quickly before helping carry dishes to the table. Emily entered last, lingering beside me in the kitchen for a second longer than necessary. You okay? She whispered quietly. I nodded once. Better than I have been in years. Dinner unfolded almost normally at first. Vanessa complimented the food repeatedly with slightly exaggerated enthusiasm. Daniel discussed work. Emily stayed mostly quiet, studying everyone carefully over the rim of her water glass. I noticed Vanessa glancing around the house several times throughout the evening. The antique clock in the hallway. Richard's paintings above the fireplace. The silver serving set passed down from my mother. Inventory. Once you recognize greed, you start seeing its fingerprints everywhere. Halfway through dessert, there was a knock at the front door. Vanessa looked up immediately. Daniel frowned slightly. Are you expecting someone? He asked. Yes, I answered calmly, folding my napkin beside my plate. Actually, I am. I walked toward the foyer slowly while silence settled uneasily behind me. When I returned, Martin Keller followed quietly at my side, carrying a slim leather briefcase. Vanessa's posture stiffened almost instantly. Daniel looked confused. Mom. I resumed my seat carefully before speaking. Martin has handled Richard's estate matters for many years. Martin nodded politely while placing several folders onto the dining room table. The atmosphere changed immediately. Not dramatic, just colder, like everyone suddenly sensed the room had shifted into honesty. Vanessa attempted a small laugh. Well, this feels serious. It is, I replied gently. Nobody moved after that. Even the soft jazz music from the living room seemed distant now. I folded my hands together and looked first at Daniel, then at Vanessa. Over the past several years, I have noticed increasing concern regarding my finances, my home, and my ability to manage my own affairs. Daniel opened his mouth immediately. Mom, nobody is questioning your ability. I held up one hand calmly. He stopped speaking. Please let me finish. Vanessa crossed one leg slowly beneath the table, but I noticed her fingers tighten around her wine glass. After Easter, I continued, certain things became very clear to me. Nobody mentioned the card directly. They did not need to. Shame was already sitting at the table with us. Martin opened one of the folders carefully and slid several documents toward me. Richard created protections years ago to ensure Mrs. Whitmore maintained complete control over all primary assets and property holdings. He explained professionally. Daniel blinked twice. What does that mean? Martin answered plainly. It means the majority of family assets do not transfer automatically through inheritance assumptions. Silence. Deep and absolute. Vanessa's expression barely changed, but years of observing people taught me how panic hides beneath polished faces. I have also decided, I said softly, to restructure portions of my estate moving forward. Daniel stared at me now like a stranger. Restructure? I nodded once. Certain charitable organizations will receive significant contributions. Educational trusts are being adjusted, and all future financial decisions regarding my property will remain exclusively mine. Vanessa finally spoke. Helen, this feels very sudden. I looked directly at her for the first time all evening. No, I said quietly. What was sudden was finally seeing things clearly. Nobody touched dessert after that. The candles burned low between us while years of unspoken truths settled heavily across the table. And for the first time in a very long time, I realized I was no longer frightened of disappointing any of them. After that dinner, the family changed in small, quiet ways. Daniel stopped calling every other day. Vanessa stopped sending cheerful group messages filled with staged photographs and inspirational quotes about gratitude. Even church felt different now. People still smiled at me politely, but the smiles carried awareness instead of assumption. Once truth enters a room, even silently, it changes the temperature forever. 2 weeks later, I stood in my garden trimming dead branches from the rose bushes when Emily arrived unexpectedly carrying an overnight bag. She looked exhausted. Older somehow. Can I stay here for a few days? She asked softly. I set the gardening shears down immediately. You never need permission to come home to me. Her eyes filled with tears at that word. Home. That evening, we made spaghetti together while soft rain tapped against the kitchen windows. Emily talked more than I had heard her talk in years. About school. About pressure inside the house. About the way Vanessa monitored every conversation, every outfit, every opinion until nobody knew what they actually thought anymore. Dad just goes along with everything now, she whispered while twisting pasta onto her fork. It is easier for him. Easier. I thought about that word long after she went upstairs to sleep. Most betrayals inside families do not begin with cruelty. They begin with convenience. With silence. With people deciding discomfort matters more than honesty. The next morning, Daniel finally called. His voice sounded tired. Mom, he said quietly, Emily should not be dragged into adult issues. I looked out the kitchen window at Emily sitting on the back swing Richard built years ago, her face lifted toward the spring sunlight for what looked like the first peaceful moment in months. Children notice more than adults think, I replied calmly. Daniel exhaled heavily. Vanessa feels like everyone is judging her. I almost answered immediately. Then I stopped myself. For years I rushed to comfort people who hurt me simply because they were uncomfortable facing consequences. Daniel, I said gently, your wife publicly humiliated your mother at Easter dinner. Silence answered me. And you defended her. Another silence. Longer this time. Finally, his voice dropped almost to a whisper. I did not realize how bad things had become. There it was. Not a full apology, but the first honest sentence I had heard from my son in years. Neither did I admitted softly. After we hung up, I walked outside carrying 2 glasses of lemonade and sat beside Emily beneath the maple trees. Warm wind moved through the branches overhead while birds chirped somewhere beyond the fence line. Spring had fully arrived without asking anyone for permission. Emily leaned her head lightly against my shoulder. Grandma. Yes. Are you angry? I thought carefully before answering. Across the yard, sunlight caught the old swing chains Richard installed decades earlier. Rusted now. Weathered. Still holding. No, I said finally. I think I was sad for a very long time. But I am not sad anymore. And it was true. Somewhere between the humiliation at Easter and the quiet dinner that followed, something inside me had changed permanently. I no longer needed approval from people committed to misunderstanding me. I no longer confused access with love. Weeks later, I found the little Easter card again while cleaning my purse. The black letters still looked sharp against the cream-colored paper. The failure. I stared at it for a moment before placing it carefully into the fireplace and striking a match beneath the corner. The flames curled slowly across the words until nothing remained except soft gray ash. Outside the window, Emily laughed at something while watering flowers near the porch, and for the first time in years, the sound of family no longer felt heavy. It felt honest. Richard used to say that some people spend their entire lives trying to shrink others because small people are easier to control. Maybe he was right. But standing there in the warm glow of late afternoon while spring sunlight filled the house around me, I realized something even more important. They called me a failure because they needed me to believe it first. And the moment I stopped believing them, their power disappeared.